أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بها الكرب على أجسام أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد أول الأنوار الفائضة من بحور عظمة الذات المتحقق في عالمي البطون والظهور بمعاني الأسماء والصفات، فهو أول حامد ومتعبد بأنواع العبادات والقربات، والممد في عالمي الأرواح والأشباح لجميع الموجودات، وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجه الكريم في المراء واليقظات، وتعرفنا بك وبه في جميع المراتب والحضارات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والفترات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات، والطف بنا يا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. تفضل مولانا. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير.
So from 49, apart from the many unproven assumptions.
Is that right, Sheikhna?
That's where you want us to start from, yes?
Yeah. I can read if you want. I just like your voice.
No, alhamdulillah. I'm happy to read, absolutely. No, let's begin.
All right.
And of course, if you have any problems with the microphone, I think it's fine the way it is, but please let me know if anything happens. Please intervene.
Beautiful.
Bismillah. Apart from the many unproven assumptions that constitute the foundation of Kant's critical project, then, there are several instances of what appear to be formal inconsistencies in Kant's first critique. One of the most famous is the question of how things in themselves can be known to have a causal relationship in bringing about the affectivity of the knowing subject in sensation, when this implies the very application of the concept of cause beyond possible experience, by which Kant justifies his censure of traditional metaphysics. Yet, in his later book, Kant's Criticism of Metaphysics, Walsh points out perhaps the most glaring inconsistency in all of Kant's work. Quote, by an elaborate argument, Kant seeks to establish that we can have knowledge in some areas and not in others. We can have knowledge in mathematics, pure and applied. We can arrive in science and in daily life at many different kinds of truth about things phenomenal. What we cannot do is know what lies beyond the bounds of possible experience. All our knowledge is ultimately rooted in intuitions as well as concepts, and the only form of intuition available to us is sense intuition. It follows that knowledge, in its human form at least, is basically bound to sense. But what of the claim that it is? Is that supposed to represent a bit of sense knowledge? In the language of our own study, were he to have been fully consistent, Kant would have had to have faced the vexed question of whether or not his own theory, that we cannot know things as they are, corresponds to things as they are, to nafs al-amr, or not. If it does not, he has wasted volumes of intricate argumentation on a theory he knows to be false. And if it does, then he has achieved the very non-empirical knowledge of things as they are that it has been the purpose of his entire project to prove impossible, which, in its absurdity, also entails the falsity of his point of view. But of course, Kant never confronted this problem. Quote, how shall we mark off this knowledge of, quote, reality, which is legitimate from other purported knowledge of the same general kind, which is not? How shall we avoid admitting the main results of the analytic are arrived at by a species of intellectual insight which they themselves claim to be unavailable to human beings? It is to say the least unfortunate that Kant does not address himself to these and similar questions.
Jazakumullah khairan. So this is just to sum up what we've been laboriously investigating over the past 10 or so sessions, perhaps slightly more, going through the possibility of metaphysics, the meta-critique of Kant and the possibility of metaphysics, which is basically an expansion of these 2 pages. It's just pointing out that Kant hasn't provided substantiation for his claims that his principial starting points are actually true, and that he's justified in assuming them. Things like sensibility and the understanding are really distinct faculties, the fusion of which alone produces genuine knowledge, the only genuine knowledge which we can achieve, which is knowledge of appearances, because the prescription itself doesn't constitute part of the fusion of sensibility and intuition. Just like saying there is no intellectual intuition dogmatically, that is the direct relation to an intelligible state of affairs, also doesn't constitute an instance of his own prescription for the only possible manifestation of true knowledge, which is, again, intuitions, which are the form and matter of sensibility, the form being time and space, the matter being sensation, fused with concepts, the concepts of the understanding, which are the categories. It doesn't constitute an instance of that, and so it doesn't reach the standards required by Kant for true legitimate knowledge as pertaining to empirical reality. So the framework itself, upon which everything rests, has no basis for its establishment. It can't be established according to Kant's own prescriptions. And of course, there are a lot of details of that which we went into. But what it ultimately comes down to is, again, we covered in the last section of the last book, is that Kant believes his philosophy to be true. He believes it to be the standard of all certainty, as we saw. The pragmatist attempts to make him into a pragmatist, when pragmatism is simply one of the children of Kant. It's just one of the ways to interpret particularly the practical philosophy of Kant, but it's repudiated by Kant himself in the strongest possible terms. So the attempt to make him a pragmatist, Kant is not saying that this is actually true in any traditional sense. It's simply that it works to produce a goal that he has in mind, a practical end which he has in mind, which is the creation of a systematic, rationally ordered framework within which we situate all of our knowledge claims. That doesn't hold up to reason, because it contradicts some of Kant's core and explicit claims about his philosophy. So at the end of 50, Kant's subjectivizing project falls victim then to the dogmatism of its assumptions and the inconsistency of its application of its own principles. Although the a priori categories are not entirely unlike the general concepts or transcendentals, the umur amma, in that they constitute the universal concepts that necessarily condition all objects of experience, they are in a considerably more important way very much unlike the umur al-amma, in that they do not uncover an underlying intelligible structure of reality. They merely project the structure of our subjective perception onto a world that they cannot truly cognize, precisely because of the shadow that they have cast. So again, this is one of Kant's fundamental assumptions that then spills over into later philosophy, particularly Nietzsche and others, particularly in the quote that you see right at the beginning of this in the preface, which is the idea that the sheer fact that we do see things from a perspective precludes the original possibility, precludes any possibility whatsoever that we can know things as they are in themselves. So it's this idea that, as Nietzsche said, we cannot see round our own corner. Because we have a perspective, and of course that's something that's a premise that we accept, we all see reality from a perspective. But the point is, there are perspectives that correspond enough to other, and there are perspectives that don't correspond to enough to other. They are not able to make that distinction because they say the fact that we have cognitive apparatuses means that reality must be skewed to accord with those cognitive apparatuses. So they merely project, in that understanding, the structure of our subjective perception onto a world that we cannot truly cognize precisely because of the shadow that they have cast. So they're not illuminating the nature of reality. So again, as we said, the elephant in the room there is, well, what if reality itself is imbued with rational principles? It's constituted by rational principles. And there's a single thread of intelligibility effusing from the extramental object, spilling over into minds, if you want to look at it like that, or that there is an intelligible realm that becomes manifest in two ways. It becomes manifest as individuated objects, for the purposes of what we're talking about. It becomes manifest as individuated objects, and it becomes manifest as knowing subjects who reflect not so much in an abstractive sense extramental reality construed as particulars, but rather both are mazahir of that intelligible reality, of that independently existing intelligible reality. And so there's this concordance between them, not because extramental particulars are primary being, but because they both constitute manifestations of the same exemplary reality. So that's one other way of looking at it. So we dealt with that also in the last section of the last thing we were reading. The truth, however, is that concepts are themselves objects, albeit the mere outward tips of intelligible objects. Moreover, insofar as they are also effects, they're able, via the henological intuition, to unveil these exemplary objects. So the henological intuition here is the fact that we see multiple instantiations of those concepts in different mazahir, in different applications, in different contexts, in different consciousnesses. And the one over the many is that there has to be something underlying each of these deficient instances of the manifestation of the concept. So there's an assent to that underlying reality, which makes the mutual intelligibility of the instances possible. I.e., that is the form, the concepts are universal. As Gerson's done a very nice chapter on, the forms are not universal. They're neither universal nor particular. The idea that everything has to be universal or particular is acquiescing to certain Aristotelian assumptions, which you don't have to acquiesce to. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. So the form is the underlying spiritual reality. It's not a strange, autistic, floating, abstract object in some weird mathematical heaven or whatever it's supposed to be, but it's an underlying spiritual, living spiritual reality. And one of its manifestations, one of its mazahir is, or becomes realized in concepts. So when we perceive the particular...
Sheikh, can I ask a question? Or I don't want to, it's me, Asfandia. I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, illuminate us.
I was just wondering, so obviously the book speaks a lot about this intuition of the one over the many.
Yeah.
Is this, how does this, in terms of the epistemology here, how does this rational intuition work? So my assumption is that it's something like Aristotle's noetic seeing, the way that we observe many different particulars, and then we have this noesis, which allows us to identify discrete, distinct essences in the world. Is the one over the many the same kind of principle, except for instead of discrete essences, it's, well, this is a red thing here and a red thing there, and you see that really you're just seeing different images of the same, of the same actual substance. But is it the same kind of, is it the same distinction between dianoia and noesis that's going on?
Yes,
here?
it fits into the framework of dianoia and noesis. So of course, dianoia pertains to the level of soul, in the sense that there is a motion involved. So you are moving from premises to conclusion. كل جسم مؤلف كل مؤلف محدث كل جسم محدث. Right? You're moving from every A is B and every A is B and every B is C to every A is C. So there is this movement happening, right, which presupposes the intelligible objects that grant it intelligibility, but it's not the intelligible objects themselves, it's the motion towards a conclusion, but presupposing the distinct intelligibility of reality already. Now, your relation to the distinct intelligibility of reality is noesis. Now, of course, Aristotle has a different understanding because he's an immanentist, and yes, he believes in incorporeal substances, which are causes of motion, but he doesn't believe in exemplary causation, and that's very, very important indeed, because it makes a world of difference. So people get confused and say, oh no, Aristotle's not so bad because he has incorporeal substances which cause motion. Yeah, but they're not exemplary causes. Distinct intelligibility, as we experience it in this world, is a function of this lowest level of manifestation emanating from the motion of those higher principles. It's not that which is mutlaq in itself, that which is uninstantiated in itself and has a distinct intelligible life and reality, becomes limited and determinate and enters time and space under particular individuation conditions, and so participates in that higher reality, as in the Platonic understanding. So it's a very different understanding. Now, the intuition, the henological, what I'm calling the henological intuition of the one over the many, is not just an intuition of the distinct intelligibility of the world, i.e., I can look at the various constituents of my experience and say, there's a human individual, there's a sofa, there's a carpet, there's a tree, there's a glass window. No, this is something that understanding presupposes ontologically, which is, so the henological intuition is an intuition into the underlying essence which grants intelligibility to all of the particulars. So we have ordinary distinctness of the world, which is in a way the outward tip of that exemplary form. It's the consequence of the concretization of the reality, which is hypostasized, or whatever you want to say, as a result, in virtue of the existence of that prior principle. So we experience the world as distinct, but that's only because there exist exemplary realities granting intelligibility to the particulars, the one over the many granting distinct intelligibility to those particulars. And that's not a conceptual entity. That's a substantial entity in the most real possible sense, in the sense of not accepting, not having blind taqlid of Aristotle's notion of primary substance, but rather going back to the traditional Platonic understanding of primary substance, of primary being, sorry, which is substance, in that it's characterized by the Magister Gene. It has the qualities of timelessness and ontological priority and not being subject to the vicissitudes of individual instantiation and change. So the henological intuition is an intuition into the being and necessity of that reality. And this is dealt with in this idea of an intellectual intuition into the necessity of the forms is dealt with in the Metacritique of Kant book. I think I have that here, but yes, Maulana, what do you think about that?
Yeah, my question is, for Aristotle, it seems to be premised on a process of induction. You see this thing which kind of looks similar to this other thing, which kind of looks similar to this other thing, and then you have this moment of noesis where you say, okay, well, actually, these are all cows, and you've identified this distinct essence of this distinct natural kind in the world.
Yeah.
So are we? I'd imagine that the Platonists would want to not tie this down to a process of induction, and it's that I guess the mental procedure aspects of it by which we come to have the intuition of these true substances.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it happens via induction, then that's absolutely fine. Obviously, there are lots of different types of induction.
Yeah.
And it's not just this kind of psychological self-deception that I saw one that looked like that, looked like that, looked like that, looked like that, and therefore they must all be such and such. And I'm just convincing myself based on my deficient everyday experience, which is obviously the kind of straw man assumption about induction versus deduction, is that all you have to do is find one other instance which isn't like that, and then you'll find that you actually haven't uncovered.
Well, the reason that doesn't work on at least the Aristotelian account is because you're not just doing pattern recognition. You're actually identifying the essential features of something in the world through a process that involves you noticing commonalities, but that doesn't just end there, or that's not just only that.
Exactly.
Which is what Hume misses.
Right, exactly. So, we have a distinction between istiqra' naqis and istiqra' tam. And istiqra' tam involves a taqsim aqli, which is where you're actually uncovering, as you said, the essential characteristics of something. Now, but for me, that's kind of by the by, because at the end of the day, if you want to call it induction, fine. But at the end of the day, what are you uncovering? Is it something which doesn't exist?
Mm-hmm.
Like Aristotle entails, I would say. Because if you're uncovering something which doesn't exist, that's not very useful. How can something which doesn't exist be a cause of knowledge? And that's why I find Aristotle to be generally merely descriptive of reality. He has a brilliant description of reality, but it's not actually a metaphysical causal explanation much of the time. So the point is, underlying the appearances of a distinct instance of intelligibility, I don't mean in the sense of individual, I mean a distinct example of intelligibility, there has to be that distinct intelligibility in itself. It's presupposed by its individual appearances. So that's the general idea. How does that actually take place in terms of a psychological process?
Yeah,
how does it actually take place? Well, it's a direct, what is an intuition? An intellectual intuition is a direct relation to a distinct state of affairs, right? And Kant, for example, says that intuition is limited to sensible intuitions. And this whole discussion that we've been through in the Metacritique of Kant is saying that that is an unduly dogmatic assumption.
And self-defeating.
Right. And that, so there is a munasaba that our hearts have, that our souls have. Now, when people speak of the aql, they're very often ambiguous as to what they're talking about. So usually people say aql and they either forgot to specify or they don't know that they mean the discursive intellect or dianoia, as in the aql which is in motion from premises to conclusion, right? Now, aql, my favorite understanding of aql, and the one which accords with what we later find in the Shaykh al-Akbar, is that of Imam al-Ghazali, which is where he says all of the terms, the aql, the ruh, the qalb, the nafs, are actually synonymous. And that means that the discursive intellect becomes a specific mode of aql, presupposing that more fundamental mode, which is simply the direct relation, because of a munasaba, an intrinsic munasaba, of the knowing subject to reality, right? Now, so we are hearts, we're souls, we're arwah, we're nufus on that synonymous account. Of course, the synonymous account is not the only one that makes sense. It's just that that is the broadest understanding. And we have a direct relation to reality. We are a determination of reality, and we also have this mirror-like being which represents wherever we've been placed, both sensibly and intelligibly, to accord with our particular individuation conditions, right? And so when we become drowned in physicality and we don't remember Allah Ta'ala, then we reflect a very murky reality, which is this extreme multiplication of quyud, of restrictions. And we live in illusion because it's not open-topped to the higher realities that give rise to it. So that's that direct relation. So we come to identify with empirical, sensible, corporeal reality. And that's what we are mirroring. So we have this direct intuition, because the sensible intuition is also an intuition. It's not discursive reason. A lot of people who talk about reason and aql and ilm al-kalam and all of this stuff today, and who don't know what they're talking about, and then they do inkar on the Akbarians or the Ashraqis in the broadest sense, and by extension also Imam al-Ghazali in most of his works. The fundamental error one finds that they've made is they don't really distinguish. They don't really know that they exist, actually, and the naive realists and
they think it's all mystical cognition, when really some of this is mystical cognition, and some of this is just simply the noesis on which all other knowledge and thought depends.
Absolutely, and there's also a distinct thread of, there's a continuity of intelligibility between mystical cognition and everything else. And the point is, mystical cognition is very likened to sensible cognition, because it's this direct relation, this irreducible relation to an object. And just as sensible cognition is necessary, right? The fact that I have this experience of this particular sensible object is now necessary. And the fact that I've had this experience of this mystical reality is necessary. In fact, Imam Said Nursi beautifully makes this connection in his commentary on one of his logical works. Is it the Burhan, or it could be the other one? I'd have to go back to it, but one of those two. He identifies, in fact, that's a slightly different context, that he's talking about awwaliyat, and he says that mystical cognition, kashf, has the same structure of ascent as the awwaliyat, right?
Interesting.
Which is very interesting. But sensible intuition is also necessary. What is not necessary are the empirical features of a thing, because they could also you could always have another experience which would negate the experiences you've had thus far. But the fact that you had that distinct experience, that's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. Your kashf experience is also necessary. You've had that experience. It's then up to the aql to make sense of that experience within the overall system of the world that you have, where there are relations between all of your different types of experience. There are hallucinations, there are false experiences, there are satanic experiences, there are all sorts of different experiences. You can't deny that you have the experience. But if you have an experience which also encompasses and absorbs your aql in the ordinary sense of the motion of thought, and that encompasses your experience of everyday empirical reality, in the sense that you can see the derivability of the empirical reality from that kashf experience, then that constitutes a very powerful verification of the truth and reality. It's almost becomes synonymous with truth of the kashf experience, because it's what has bestowed intelligibility on those lower levels of experience. So if you have an experience of the haqiqa Muhammadiyya, for example, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. If you have an experience of the haqiqa Muhammadiyya and you see the manner in which the rest of reality emerges from the haqiqa Muhammadiyya as its template, it's very difficult to then, and that grants you this extraordinary illumination, this extraordinary understanding and heightened intelligibility of the subsequent levels of experience. Very difficult for you to say, well, that's not a legitimate experience, because it's not ordinary sense experience, because you're then holding an elevated illuminative experience to the standard of something which has been shown to you to be immensely paltry and quite insignificant and trivial, and also not in itself sufficient, because it's not causally, it doesn't contain its own explanation, sensible empirical reality. And so that's why if you limit your framework of justification to just that sense of necessity that you have as pertaining to ordinary experience, then you're basically operating in terms of what is really, it's just a philosophy of description. It's just you're just describing what you see. And you can then conceive of those patterns that you uncover as, yes, essential realities, but you're only conceiving of them, you're only having isti'ab of them, you're only grasping them in terms of their immanent appearances, right? Now, how can you transcend the immanent? It's only possible because there's an isomorphism between the knowing subject and the object. So when you identify as knowing subject with a certain level amidst the multifarious possibilities for your own self-realization. Sorry, I'm sounding like a German idealist here accidentally. You are only going to be able to see an object which has a munasaba to that level that you have stopped at. But that's also another argument for exemplary realities, because when you see further into the reality, when you come to know more about it, it's because there's been a corresponding ascent in your being as knowing subject. So, this is the broad Platonic, again, in the broadest sense. I'm not a Platonist in any sense that would be recognizable to the vast majority of people, but in the broadest methodological alternative to the Mashai, which is the Ashraqi approach, where the purification of the heart is the absolute sine qua non to the acquisition of knowledge, and also to your ability to correctly uncover reality and then describe it, rather than blithely ignoring the contribution of the knowing subject and then saying, I'm just describing reality based on pure aql, premise to premise. So in any case, it's a wide-ranging discussion. I'm talking to the great Asfandiar, so they could go on forever.
It sounds a bit like Plato's divided line in terms of the structure. Is that the same basic structure of this, or are there any important differences?
Yes, it's the basic structure, of course.
Right. No.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sheikh.
Thank you so much. I like Asfandiar. He makes me think. All right. So, where are we? Oh, hold on. I put my glasses back on. I can't see anymore as of last year. All right. Now, the truth, however, is that concepts are themselves objects, albeit the mere outward tips of intelligible objects. Moreover, insofar as they are also effects, they're able via the henological intuition to unveil these exemplary objects. So, sorry, to get to the answer, your soul as purified has an intrinsic munasaba to the intelligible world. So once you've got rid, one has rid oneself of all of the dirt, as it were, of hyper multiplicitous multiplication of quyud reality. The soul, the spirit that you uncover on that synonymous account has an intrinsic munasaba to the intelligible world. It sees it directly. And then it sees the fact that that world is then informing the world of ordinary cognition, and that there's this direct thread of continuity of intelligibility, just as there's also this continuity of intelligibility of the knowing subject, in that you can trace the process by which I went from not being able to see the spiritual reality to being able to see it. When we perceive the particular, we are intuiting the underlying form that renders the particular intelligible, as well as the principles constituting the ontological framework for the appearance of any instantiation of a species. Concepts that themselves possess prior exemplary realities and are ultimately rooted in the divine attributes. So what is this exemplary reality? How can we conceive of an uninstantiated, weird, abstract object? And what's the point of that? Horrible. Well, it's not what anyone's saying, but it's an enduring myth in the history of philosophy. As Gerson says, actually, of the idea that forms are universals. But this is a different myth. This is this idea that, and it's an absurd idea, and it's rightly judged absurd, which is the idea that, yes, it's just a strange, unconscious realm of somehow distinct intelligibility, just inert abstract objects which somehow got there and they're not really doing anything. But no, what is the exemplary reality we're talking about? It might be an angel. Might be one of the arwah. Might be al-aql al-awwal, in the sense of the first madhar in the world of spirits of the al-haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya. That is the exemplary reality of the thing. It's not the image that takes that exemplary reality will then spill into the, that's not a good way to say it, but it will then effuse into, it will then emanate, is even worse, into the world of imaginal representations, where it then takes on innumerable imaginal forms, and then it becomes concretized in this world as one image. But then when we have an intuition into Alam al-Mithal, that's how symbolism here is possible. Because actually that single meaning has multiple images that instantiated in Alam al-Mithal. But they're ultimately rooted in the divine attributes. So we have you have exemplary forms of species, for example, of a tree, of a human being, of the sky, of the heavens, of the mineral world, of rocks, of fish, and lobsters. But you also have a very different type of object, which are what you could call the transcendentals, but I don't mean to limit that to, let's say, the medieval lists or the Umur Amma. But these have their transcendentality, as it were, puts them into a different category. And that's why they have a special status, because they pertain to everything. And that's why their exemplary realities are the governing divine attributes, right? So you see unity everywhere, for example, and it becomes manifest in all of these different madahir, but it's ultimately the divine unity which is becoming manifest. And that's why it has this universality of application. I've just got a message here, let's see. Wa alaikum assalam, Samil. How are you, Habibi?
Alhamdulillah, I'm well, Sheikhna. How about yourself?
Alhamdulillah, very good.
Sorry, I was just in the middle of typing something. I didn't mean to send just the salam by itself.
Oh, right. So you were just saying assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, but I just had a thought which came to my mind, if that was okay. So the fact that we can recognize distinct intelligible objects, is that not like an indication for the sort of, I don't know whether there's the right way to put it, but sort of like the a priori affinity we have for all the forms? If we didn't, then that object would not be intelligible at all in the first place. So even if there is this sort of inductive account of the discursive intellect coming to know the essence of an object, it's not that we acquire the affinity, acquire knowledge of that cognitive capacity to recognize the form from that, because or else we would not be able to recognize the object in and of itself in the first place.
No, because our spirits are existing in the spirit world all the time. So that's the fundamental basis of the possibility itself that you're talking about. But our ability to come to knowledge of that in the embodied state, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, so there's a difference between the discursive intellect coming to acquire knowledge of what is the essential reality of this particular object.
Exactly, in the process of purification, that pertains to our instantiated reality here in the corporeal world. We are making contact with our ruh, which is already there.
Right, I see.
It's already yonder.
Yeah.
But so that's who we really are. That's our real identity, but we can't see it because of our embodied state.
I see. Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikhna. It's just the intrinsic point we have.
So that in particular is intuited directly in sensation, despite being stripped of the species nature and the umur amma and superordinate principles that brought it into relief as a distinct entity, cannot stand up to scrutiny. So this idea that I can have my direct intuition of the particular, like in Schmidt's account of Ockham and Duns Scotus in his book, but I don't have to invoke or recognize or see the entailment of the necessity of an actual intelligible reality making that possible. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny. that's contained within that intuition. It's irreducibly presupposed to phenomena. It's there, you can just ignore it if you want, and then your philosophy won't make sense. Intuition, construed as the direct relation of the knowing subject to the fundamental constituents of reality, is fundamentally intellectual in a sense that embraces the spiritual, again, on that account of the synonymity of Imam al-Ghazali. And Imam al-Ghazali, yeah, I'm getting a bit of a soft spot for him, I have to say. Yeah, existence is a very distinct but just Mishkat al-Anwar is fantastic. Existence is a very distinct but unindividuated, or distinct and individuated, but all are distinct and therefore subsistent. I don't go for that distinct, the fundamental ontology of extramental, particular, and mental. I'd get rid of that personally and replace it with distinct but unindividuated and distinct and individuated. But all are intuited, but all are distinct and therefore subsistent. Both forms of object are intellectually intuited before, not in the temporal sense, but in the sense of priority. They can, in the case of physically individuated beings, be sensed. The distinction between intuition and concept as framed by Kant is thus false, because you can't separate them in that way. The intuition is only conceptually grasped. That's how you single it out. That's what one of the points made in the last thing that we read. Although doubtless facile parallels with altogether different philosophical contexts must be avoided at all costs, otherwise Karim Laham will be upset with me, a risk of anachronism, there is also an unavoidable extent to which quite different philosophical frameworks correspond to a lesser or greater degree to Nafs al-Amal, and thus possess a sufficient degree of commensurability to make comparisons genuinely fruitful. And indeed, Kant's insight that pure thought cannot achieve a great deal on its own without adequate matter is far more satisfactorily framed by Ibn Arabi in his distinction between the receptive and discursive intellects that we've already seen, in which such matter can involve revealed and mystical truth. That's where it's likened to sensible knowledge, ironically, alongside those yielded by sense. In every cognition, we stand in direct relation to restricted being. So in direct relation to restricted being in terms of our own restrictedness, but then in terms of our own unrestrictedness of our soul as knowing subject, we stand in direct relation to unrestricted being, which is only cognizable and ontologically possible because of its principle of unity, right? So restricted being is only cognizable and ontologically possible because of its principle of unity, a superordinate degree of unrestricted being, not restricted at least in the manner in which the subordinate degree is restricted. So I'm not saying it's unrestricted mutlaq, but it has different individuation conditions. So again, بعض المتحذلقين, as I'm allowed to say that because Mullah Fanari says it, بعض المتحذلقين would say that, well, uninstantiated doesn't even make sense because, it's obviously everything has to be individuated some way or other because you can't pick it out otherwise. I'm not saying that things don't have other individuation conditions, which from our vantage point here you call tamayuz, not ta'ayun. With respect to themselves, it's ta'ayun. Right, but they're different individuation conditions. So I say uninstantiated. I mean uninstantiated with respect to the individuated things here. It's not individual weighted in the same way that the individuated thing that it's making sense of is individuated. So that's the Akbarian principle that kullu ta'ayyunin yaqtadi sabqa la ta'ayyun alayhi. So our direct relation to restricted being is, in fact, a direct relation to unrestricted being via the conditions of the intelligibility of that restricted being. And indeed, through restricted being, we come into contact with exemplary beings of a lesser restrictedness, which possess a close relationship to pure unrestricted being. And this does not merely constitute blind inference from effect to cause, a mere grasping amongst concepts, but entails direct experience every step of the way. But we will pursue all of these contentions further in chapter 4. The naturalizing epistemological trajectory of Western thought then, from Duns Scotus to Ockham and on to later Western empiricism, reached a critical juncture in the thought of Kant. Knowledge was first terrestrialized, then it was made into the sole reality or denied altogether. But let us return now to theories of the ontological ground of truth from the Islamic world. Right. I'm really upset with Imam al-Suyuti. He was so rude writing a book called Tanbih al-Ghabi. Why didn't he have respect for the ulama? Shall we read on, Niaz, the naturalizing epistemological trajectory?
Yes. Okay, from this paragraph. The naturalizing epistemological trajectory of Western thought, then, from Duns Scotus to Ockham, and on to later Western empiricism, reached a critical juncture in the thought of Kant. Knowledge was first terrestrialized, then it was made into the sole reality or denied altogether. But let us return now to theories of the ontological ground of truth from the Islamic world. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, a contemporary of Averroes, Ibn Rushd, would in that Islamic world go on to prove a far more influential philosopher than the Andalusian sage, although conversely, Razi was himself effectively unknown in the West. An eminent Avicennan student and critic, Razi recognized the difficulties presented by abstract objects because of his familiarity with Avicenna's demonstration of mental existence, which he initially appears to accept in his Al-Mabahith al-Mashriqiyya. The tensions created by these difficulties would prove instrumental to the development of his highly influential and original treatments of truth. Although he does not use the actual term nafs al-amr in the following excerpts, Razi is nonetheless directly answering the question of what is it that grounds the apparatuses of our cognition, and what it is that thereby guarantees their truth and their utilization in true propositions. In his vast commentary on the Isharat, the theory is a mere suggestion meant to form part of his attempt to undermine the theory of, quote, mental existence, al-wujud al-dhihni, a doctrine that he seems to have opposed throughout his post-Mabahith career. In the Mulakhas, his theory is more clearly defined than in the Sharh al-Isharat.
Which is definitely after the Sharh al-Isharat. That's according to the vast majority of Razian scholars. And in terms of this doctrine, it's very clear that there's a development. Because it's, as it says here, it's just a mere suggestion in the Isharat. It's not a fully formed thought. But then in the Mulakhas, it becomes this fully fledged doctrine, where rarely for Razi we have وَنَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا. Right? So, yeah, go on, my love.
Okay. So, quote, we know by necessity that awareness, ash-shu'ur, cannot become actualized except when a specific relation obtains between the one who has the awareness, ash-sha'ir, and the thing that he is aware of, al-mash'uru bihi. We also know by necessity that relations do not become actualized except via the actualization of the two relata, mutadayifain. Moreover, a thing can either know itself or something other than itself. If it knows itself, it is impossible for this knowledge to become actualized while the object of knowledge does not exist in particularized essences, al-a'yan. One's own existence, then, must itself be sufficient for this knowledge to become actualized. When one knows something other than oneself, one is also able to come to know this thing, which is other than oneself, when it is not directly present to one. Ma'a adamihi fil hudur. مع عدمه في الحضور. It must then have some other form of subsistence. Those who affirm the existence of mental forms assert that they are impressed in the mind, but we assert, in accordance with Imam Plato's position, that they are self-subsistent ideas. وَنَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا مثلا قائمة بأنفسها. is مثلا, correct?
Yeah.
تمام. ونحن أثبتناها مثلا قائمة بأنفسها على قول الإمام أفلاطون. This is the conclusion I have come to on this topic after thorough and impartial investigation. Imam Razi's theory arose as a way of accounting for abstract objects. The classic proof for mental existence, al-wujud al-dhihni, states that there must be an ontological basis for our intellection of distinct abstract entities, which have no extramental existence. These universal essences, forms recalled in their distinctness in the imagination, and second intelligibles, to take just a few examples, are concepts the ontological statuses of which cannot be ignored if we are to be able to take at all seriously the notion that the exercise of the sciences leads to objective knowledge, because the functioning of the sciences is entirely contingent upon the ability of these entities to represent the intelligible features of things as they are in themselves. The argument for al-wujud al-dhihni is that these concepts must enjoy some form of existence, because one cannot, quote, relate mentally to something which had no form of existence whatever.
So the proof for mental existence is the following, right? You're welcome to write it down if you like, because as I said before, I'd like us to build up a body of arguments which we can just refer to, have on the tip of the tongue. So it's نتعقل ما لا ثبوت له في الخارج, right? So we intellect that which has no ثبوت في الخارج, right? نتعقل ما لا ثبوت له في الخارج إذ نحكم على الممتنعات إيجابا ونجد من المفاهيم كلية ومن القضايا حقيقية ويمتنع الإضافة إلى العدم الصرف. Right? So we intellect that which doesn't have extramental subsistence because we make affirmative judgments on impossible entities, and we encounter universal propositions. They don't have thubut fil kharij because they're not particular entities, and universal concepts, mafahim, and qadaya haqiqiyya, right? Qadaya haqiqiyya, so you have a qadiyya dhihniyya, you have a qadiyya kharijiyya, and you have a qadiyya haqiqiyya. The qadiyya haqiqiyya is the one which has reference to nafs al-amr, rather than particularly al-kharij or particularly al-dhihn. Right? So the proposition doesn't have reference to anything that has extramental subsistence. So, and then it says, وَيَمْتَنِعُ الْإِضَافَةِ إِلَى الْعَدَمِ الصِّرْفِ. There has to be an idafa between the knowing subject and the thing that we're intellecting, because نَتَعَقَّلْ مَا لَا ثُبُوتَ لَهُ فِي الْخَارِجِ. وَيَمْتَنِعُ الْإِضَافَةِ إِلَى الْعَدَمِ الصِّرْفِ. So if something is a pure non-existent, as in it doesn't have any, it's not distinct at all, it's pure non-existence, then you can't have an idafa to it because it's not there. So where are they? Those things must be mental. They must have mental existence. And therefore, mental existence is true. So their idafa is to their mental existence. That's basically an Avicennan argument. And it's a nice argument, I don't think we should get quite as excited by it as we might want to, because it doesn't actually explain very much. And interestingly enough, it does actually, in its logical structure, as far as I'm concerned, simply invoke that Mu'tazili argument, which is that kullu ma'dumin mutamayyiz, right? Wa kullu mutamayyizin thabit fa kullu ma'dumin thabit, which is often invoked, usually without crediting Mu'tazila, but which is often invoked in various different arguments, including, as far as I'm concerned, this argument, because يمتنع الإضافة إلى العدم الصرف. So, and then they're just saying, well, then it's wujud dhihni, it's not al-ma'dum al-thabit, it's wujud dhihni. So where you then move from there is, well, if you're talking about immanent minds, my mind and your mind and everyone else's mind, then that doesn't explain anything, except that it doesn't tell you anything about the objectivity of those concepts in the sense of their embeddedness in the real structure of the reality, their ability to uncover true knowledge about reality, to yield true knowledge about reality, but rather it just says that there they are in that locus. It's only if the mind if minds in the sense of immanent minds are underwritten by transcendent mind that you're getting somewhere. And even that has to, I mean, there are lots of different iterations of that understanding, whether it's a separate agent intellect or it's Platonic forms, or it's one or another of the many different ways of construing that. You might then have the same problem with that transcendent mind if that's not adequately rooted in reality. That's why, in my humble opinion, the only understanding which gives a fully satisfactory answer, and it's not even the Platonists, the best Platonists, they don't quite get there. The only account that makes total sense of the embeddedness of intelligibility in the source of reality is the Akbarian account, where it constitutes the effects, the mazahir, the unfolding of the manifestations of the divine names. And then it's embedded in the first stage of reality, right? But otherwise, there's a problem. Where do the forms come from? Now, in the unwritten doctrines understanding that the Platonists have, they are produced by the indefinite dyad and the one, or they're produced by infinity limit. But I don't think that works particularly well. So it's infinity limit working, which is, peron and peras, working on the exemplary numbers. So there is a kind of account, they're not completely sufficient, the forms in that sense. So in any case, so he says, Imam Razi, وَنَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا مُثْلًا قَائِمَةً بِأَنفُسِهَا عَلَى قَوْلِ الْإِمَامِ أَفْلَطُونَ. We also know that he, in his, for example, his claim that all tasawwurat al-daruriyya, the problematic of that whole discussion is based on the Meno, whether directly or not doesn't matter very much, but it's definitely the same argument. And we know that Imam Razi has an explicitly Platonic account of time and space. So if we were to go to note 93, which is on page 188, deep reverence of Plato is a very interesting phenomenon that appears in different schools of philosophical thought in the 12th and 13th centuries. The most obvious figure is Suhrawardi. Another is Ibn Arabi, who says there is nothing in which it is not possible to achieve knowledge by means of unveiling and experience. Being occupied with speculative thought is a veil. Some others deem unveiling and experience impossible, though no one amongst the people of God. Those who deem it impossible are the people of speculative investigation and deduction amongst the scholars of outward appearances who have not tasted spiritual states. If some of them have tasted spiritual states, like the divine Plato amongst the philosophers, this is rare. Aflatun al-Ilahi, he says. Plato, the metaphysician, which is what the divine Plato means. Al-Fatah al-Makkiyya, volume 2, 523. More surprising is Razi's, it won't be surprising soon, but it is surprising now, is Razi's veneration of Plato's events in the above quote and elsewhere in the Malakhas and in Al-Matalib al-Aliyah. Why? Because Imam Razi was just the furthest thing from taqlid. He was the furthest thing from taqlid in the world. And he had such a vast and expansive knowledge of the history of philosophy and the different schools of philosophy. He was going through absolutely everything, applying his tahqiq to that reality, that he wasn't interested in adhering dogmatically to anything. Of course, I mean, he was far removed from any hashahu min al-taqlid. One of the ultimate critiques of taqlid is simply that of Imam al-Ghazali in the last chapter of Mizan al-Amal. That is amazing. It's a revelation. That chapter, go to the last chapter of Mizan al-Amal. It's extraordinary. It's a really extraordinary critique of holding fast dogmatically to this madhab or that madhab just because it's that madhab which is officially true. So another lovely statement on Plato you can find in Insan al-Kamil by Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Jili, who says, I met Plato in the spiritual world and I said, who are you? And he said, I am the qutb of my time, and he said, قَدْ مَلَأَ عَالَمَ الْغَيْبِ نُورًا, he says of Plato. He saw this being. He was like, who is this? He asked him. He said, I'm Plato. I was the qutb of my time. That's in the Lisan al-Kamil. So, yeah. So Imam Razi's theory arose as a way of accounting for abstract objects. Right. So maybe we should go through this argument. Okay. So al-shu'ur cannot become actualized except when a specific relation obtains between the one who has the awareness and the thing that he is aware of, right? So there's a specific relation which must obtain. We also know by necessity that relations do not become actualized except by the actualization of the two relata, right? Now, we're going to see some very similar argumentation from Al-Tursi in a minute. Wait a sec. Let's have a quick. We'll get to it in any case, but I find that intriguing. So, moreover, a thing can either know itself, right, has Wijhdani knowledge of itself, or something other than itself. If it knows itself, it is impossible for this knowledge to become actualized while the object of knowledge does not exist in particularized a'yan, essences, al-a'yan, which is obviously the fact that we exist as individuals. One's own existence then must itself be sufficient for this knowledge to become actualized. That's the basis of that relation. However, when one knows something other than oneself, one is also able to come to know this thing, which is other than oneself, even when it's not there. How's that possible? Right? So again, Razi knows that argument because it's Avicennan. The later Mutakallimun who adopt that argument, like Taftazani and the Radiyallahu anhu and Sharh in what's it called? Not Sharh al-Maqasid, the small one, Tahdhib al-Kalam.
Tahdhib al-Mantiq al-Kalam.
Yeah, thank you, Maulana. That is the same argument. So it's the same idea that the Idafa, in order for it to become actualized, the Mutadayifain have to be actualized already. They're presupposed. So when it's self-knowledge, that's no problem because your existence is sufficient. However, one can know a thing when it's not actually present to you. How are you knowing it? Now you might say, well, if you don't know philosophy, you might say, well, he had he's remembering it. I mean, he saw the object and there it was, and then he got something in his khayal, he abstracted, and then he's calling it to mind, and there, I mean, where's the mystery? The mystery is that of the distinct intelligibility presupposed by the individual object that you went and abstracted your special khayal thing from, right? That's the issue at hand. What am I making contact with? Because that image, which I'm recollecting, not in the Platonic sense, has intelligible content. Where is that intelligible content, right? So when one knows something other than oneself, one is able to come to know this thing which is other than oneself and is not directly present to one. So that poses a problem, even if it's individual objects, although you might be able to say, if you're a convinced immanentist, that, well, that reality is simply contained in the individual object. Well, then you say, well, given the arguments that invoke the agent intellect, which is that the particularity in itself does not yield universality, so you're still not getting the universality. The problem is when you're recollecting the universal, and when you're remembering, when you're calling to mind a particular image, it's still presupposing that universal content that makes it intelligible, because the particularity in itself is not intelligible. It's only the universality which is intelligible. Now, the universality is not derived from the particular object, because particularity does not yield universality. So I was going to say that, you know, a certain objection might be, you could yield it against the idea that, well, I recall, let's say, the image of an individual human being that I just met, and then I say, yes, so-and-so, and that might, it might not be such a mystery, the fact that I can recall that, because its substantial reality is just the individual that I met. Well, no, because the intelligible content is not the individual that you met. The intelligible content is the universality, which allows you to pick out that individual as a human being. So even that can be answered, but the real issue here is, what about those things which don't have aren't individuated at all, like abstract objects? That's the real motivator of the theory of mental existence. One of the, I mean, also universality, because we find mafahim kulliya, we encounter mafahim kulliya. There's also just pure abstract objects which don't, like the umur amma, like mathematical objects, like all manner of different things, like things that transcend the umur amma, right? Like the magister gene, like conjunction, like difference, and so on. And what about those? Because they don't have any form of extramental particular subsistence in the first place. So when one knows something, so that's the motivator behind both wujud dhihni and this, which is an alternative to wujud dhihni. That's the thing to bear in mind. This doctrine of Imam Razi is an alternative. He doesn't want to accept wujud dhihni. He accepts it al-mabahith al-mashriqiyya, but then he doesn't want to accept it in his later works, which I think is very noble. So it must then have some other form of subsistence. Those who affirm the existence of mental firms assert that they're impressed in the mind. But we assert, in accordance with Imam Plato's position. Now remember, this exists in all the manuscripts. It exists in Imam Mustafa Steyer's manuscript, which he gave to me many eons ago. And it is in all of the manuscripts. That's why even a group of people who really don't want Razi to say this were forced to put Imam Plato in their edition, because it says Imam Plato. So وَنَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا مُثْلًا قَائِمَةً بِأَنفُسِهَا عَلَى قَوْلِ الْإِمَامِ أَفْلَاطُونَ. This is the conclusion I've come to on this topic after thorough and impartial investigation. Imam Razi's theory arose, so again, Razi says, وَنَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا مُثْلًا قَائِمَةً بِأَنفُسِهَا عَلَى قَوْلِ الْإِمَامِ أَفْلَاطُونَ. And then you say, oh, no. Razi doesn't say that. He's not a Platonist. He doesn't affirm the Platonic forms, right? But Razi says, نَحْنُ أَثْبَتْنَاهَا, نَحْنُ أثبتناها نحن أثبتناها مثلا قائمة بأنفسها على قول الإمام أغلبه. Imam Razi's theory arose as a way of accounting for abstract objects. The classic proof for mental existence states that there must be an ontological basis for our intellectual distinct abstract entities, which have no experimental existence. All right, 95. Have anything here? We will cite Taftazani's formulation of this proof below, which is the one I already told you. So there must be an ontological basis for intellectual distinct abstracts which have no experimental existence. These universal essences, formed recalled in the distinctness of the imagination, and second, intelligibles, take just a few examples, are concepts, the ontological statuses of which cannot be ignored. If we are able to take it all seriously, the notion of the exercise of the sciences leads to objective knowledge, because the functioning of the sciences is entirely contingent upon the ability of these entities to represent the intelligible features of things as they are in themselves. Again, you can't know reality unless you make sense of what these things are. And if you just assume them and, well, never mind what they are, ontological stages, then it's just an incomplete philosophy. You're welcome to do bad philosophy. Ahlan wa sahlan, it makes you feel pious or something, but I just can't for the life of me understand why it would. So, sorry, I'm being a bit caustic, humorous. I actually love everyone and enjoy universal love for all sentient creatures and inanimate objects, even though there aren't any. So, the argument for al-wujud then is that these concepts must enjoy some form of existence because one cannot relate mentally to something which has no form of existence whatsoever. Since these concepts do not exist in the world of experimental particulars, they must actually exist in the mind. Razi does agree with this basic rationale. So he says in the Malakhas as well, if the non-existent entity that is the object of knowledge had no form of subsistence whatsoever, despite the fact that we can distinguish it from that which is other than it, something which is absolutely nothing, you see the way that these arguments are all related, would be distinct in itself. That's that were the non-existent thing to come to exist, it would add nothing to it, and that is absurd. How do you super add your existence to your non-existent entity? If it's Adam Sirf, right, then it's not there for you to add anything to it. The allegedly absolutely non-existent thing is already distinct in itself, which implies its subsistence, and yet in the interest of consistency, because we have stipulated its absolute nothingness, were existence to be super added to it, no distinct existent thing would obtain, because adding existence to nothing in particular is to cause to exist precisely nothing. In other words, mental entities, which are non-existent in extramental particulars, must nonetheless possess some form of subsistence. Again, what form? This is the logical entailment. It doesn't let you experience what it is. That's different, right? That's when your Ishraqi philosophy comes in. It's just the logical entailment. Now, if you confuse the logical distinctness of the resultant object for what it really is in itself, then yes, you'll think that Plato's a weird, Platonism in the broadest methodological sense is some sort of strange, fantastical philosophy, which is not very satisfying, but that's not what it is. We're remaining within the level of logical entailment, and we affirm its necessity, but that's not the same as meeting exemplary reality. So, in other words, mental entities which are non-existent in extramental particulars must nonetheless possess some form of subsistence because they're distinct both in themselves and with respect to other such entities. Genus and differentia, the universals of man and horse, the intelligible entities, unity and possibility, and indeed the fictional objects, phoenix and unicorn. So these are all different types of that broadest category. Each have distinct mental forms. And are distinct from one another. Unity is not possibility. The phoenix is not the unicorn. This distinctness must have some form of ontological basis, otherwise it wouldn't be able to happen. متميز كل معدوم متميز وكل متميز ثابت وكل معدوم ثابت. If something is mutamayyiz, it has to be subsistent. Otherwise, what is the mansha of the tamayuz? You see, The tamayus has to arise from something. Otherwise it wouldn't be tamayus. Right? There has to be a distinction between non-intelligible hypothetical reality and the actual reality that we encounter. The reason that it's distinct is because there's a mansha of that distinctness, which is subsistence, a form of subsistence. So this distinctness must have some form of ontological basis. This is because distinct forms can only be distinct if they possess some form of differentiated being in themselves that gives rise to their distinctness in cognition. Otherwise, why is something giving rise to distinctness which is not there? Either our minds are imposing it, as Kant would like to think, or it actually arises from something extramental. In stating his line of reasoning above, Razi has employed a famous argument associated especially with the Mu'tazila, namely that all non-existent entities are distinct, all distinct things possess subsistence, and that therefore non-existent entities possess subsistence. Again, if you want to memorize a tiny little syllogism, kullu ma'dumin mutamayiz wa kullu mutamayiz thabit fa kullu ma'dumin thabit. Right? It's what shekel is that? Anyone?
And now I'm getting disappointed too.
Sorry?
I'm just kidding.
They're also shy, Siddy, because of their ahlul suluk. That's the thing. They all know. It's al-shakl al-awwal, obviously. Al-mood al-awwal. Al-darb al-awwal. So, where is it? It was an insultingly basic question. That's why no one answered. Anyway, so where are we? 99, what does that say? For the context and debate surrounding this central argument, including extended expositions of this particular argument, see all the stuff there. In the less scrupulous of Ash'ari polemic, right? In the less scrupulous of Ash'ari polemic, the Mu'tazili position could often be, that means some of them are not unscrupulous. The Mu'tazili position, and in fact it's implied that most of them are not unscrupulous. The Mu'tazili position could often be characterized as maintaining the extramental particular existence of non-existent entities, a characterization that rendered the position starkly contradictory. In fact, this was a straw man allegation. By affirming the thabut of non-existent entities, Mu'tazila intended a mode of being subsistence distinct from extramental particular existence, akin in a certain manner to the contemporary distinction amongst certain prominent philosophers between subsistence and existence. 99. While opposed by the early Ash'aris who claimed that non-existent entities are pure nothingness, al-adam as-sir. Yeah, there's more on that at the end of section 4.1. Modified forms of the argument became widely accepted, utilized by later kalam theologians in support of such arguments as those for realism about intelligible entities in the context of wujud dhihni and nafs al-amal. So again, it's not the explicit form of the argument, it's not the same language. So it's not the explicit form, it's the same implicit form that is then used to support wujud dhihni and things. So yeah. So I'll just read one more paragraph and I think we'll stop. Where Razi does not agree with the Avicennians, however, is that such entities are in their fundamental reality mental, or that sheer mentality can constitute a guarantor of the reliable intelligibility of the distinctness of intelligible entities. Indeed, these entities exist distinctly in extra-mental reality. Mental form, I mean, that could be a khilaf lafzi if you're saying, well, yes, they're not talking about the immanent mental object, they're talking about the transcendent mental reality in terms of the separate agent intellect. And it's not actually a khilaf lafzi because it's an object of thought of the agent intellect. They are objects of thought which are not differentiated in the way that they're differentiated here because of the different individuation conditions of the agent intellect, and there's reference for that somewhere in the book. But and so it's not a khilaf lafzi in the sense that they're not distinctly existing in themselves, they're existing in a mind. Whereas these are self-subsistent, مثلا قائمة بأنفسها, as he says. So it's not a khilaf lafzi, but if you're talking about the objects of transcendent mind, then there's not a huge, it's not a fundamental difference like it becomes with the dear old Jumhur al-Mutakallimin. So instead, these entities exist distinctly in extramental reality. Mental forms only constitute sound intellections if they correspond to the extramental world. And this can only occur if there is something subsisting in the extramental world that they correspond to. Again, that's Fakhruddin Razi in the Malachas. Exactly the same intellectual principle that one might be censured for even citing in Ibn Rushd, but it's exactly the same. Ibn Rushd's identification is prime matter, which of course none of us believe in eternal prime matter. We don't even believe in Aristotelian prime matter at all. I mean, the argumentation for prime matter is intriguing, and one might use it for a different conception of matter, which is, of course, the argument for prime matter is that a body consists of, its fundamental nature is extension in the sense of the Surah Jismiyah, extendedness in 3 dimensions, but you can also cut a body in half. It can undergo all manner of different forms of infisal. So you've got the ittisal, which is a pure extension, but bodies also undergo infisal. So what is the substratum for the infisal? It can't be the ittisal itself, because then it wouldn't be ittisal, it would be infisal, right? So there has to be a substratum for both ittisal and infisal, and that's prime matter. So that's, I think, quite a good argument. But again, because your mode of argumentation is the same, it doesn't mean that your ta'yin of the resultant object that you're uncovering has to be the same.
So what is prime matter then? Or our equivalent of prime matter if we don't accept this realm of internal pure potentiality?
Well, I think Platonian matter, which you've exposited on your Twitter, is the best candidate, personally.
How does that function in contradistinction to how is the receptacle distinct from Aristotelian prime matter?
Well, you're going to have to tell us, because you wrote about it.
But I actually don't understand the difference, which is why I'm asking you. There are a number of elements with, say, the.
Well, you shouldn't have written about it then. Gosh, that's a very rare helicopter or something. No, I'm just kidding. You did a brilliant job. Well, my understanding, I did try to explain this in the last session as well, but my understanding is that, well, the problem with Aristotle's prime matter is it doesn't make any sense, because if you determine in terms of the systematic entailments of Aristotle's thought what its ontological status is, you're forced to conclude that it's just pure possibility, which doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't exist on its own, and the scrupulous Aristotelian will explain wisely to you that, oh, no, it's just form and matter don't exist on their own, but they only exist when they go together in the fusion, the hylomorphic fusion, and then, you can separate them mentally.
Yeah, it's hylomorphic substances all the way down, essentially.
Right, exactly. Now, the problem with that, if you look at the argumentation, is that the hylomorphic fusion is the substratum of the infisal and the ittisal. And yet you're saying, well, they just all go there at once, right? Which is fine, because as far as you're concerned with the Aristotelian, there's no exemplary causation. They're just this consequence of the motion of the incorporeal substances and ultimately the prime mover. And why does the world emerge in these particular conditions and this extraordinary variety and beauty and multiplicity and so on? Aristotle doesn't know, and he doesn't mind saying that he doesn't know either, because he thinks it gives him epistemological humility, which is so popular today as well. But anyway, the point is, Plotinus and many other Neoplatonists find that account of hylomorphic substance, which they reject, by the way. They'll still use the analog terms of matter and form, which is fine. But they don't. He doesn't accept that he actually has a bundle theory of body, believe it or not, as abhorrent as that would have been to me 6 or 7 years ago.
I read Hutchison's paper on this, although I have some questions there as well, but I don't want to get us too off track. We'll be here all day.
No, I mean, the basic idea of matter is that it is a consequence of the final stage of a fusion. It's caused by soul's desire to create multiple instances of what are one in intellect, capital I intellect. And intellect is just busy contemplating its own navel. It's absolutely happy to be in a state of eternal bliss, no interest in creating the world. Again, disclaimer, I'm explaining Plotinus's thought right now. This is not actually my view, but I think there's a lot to be benefited from that philosophical system. And a lot of the underlying causal mechanisms in terms of logical intelligibility, I think, are correct. It's just, again, that doesn't have to result in you coming to exactly the same conclusion. And also, when you use language such as creation, that's often metaphorical, right? You know, someone creates a Zoom session and all the people come into it. It's not, no one, including Plotinus, is saying that soul is an absolute creator. Anyway, that disclaimer aside, I mean, this could still be edited, so the disclaimer wasn't in it, which is absolutely fine. But but one mustn't be paranoid. I think the point is, soul wants to create. This is what soul does. It's the principle of motion. So it wants there to be illimitable instances, because it's looking up to intellect, of what it sees is governed by the magister genius, has this stability and distinction and identity, and in the world of the forms, it wants there to be illimitable instances. So it wants to produce the corporeal world, right? So matter is an exigency. So it's very, again, quite different from Aristotle, and in many ways quite similar, but matter is a consequence of that activity of soul, that there is a realm of possibility which emerges from soul, which we would call matter, which is the ground of the possibility for all of the individual corporeal objects to become manifest, right? But it's not so much that, I mean, you would say on the level of soul, it is an intelligible entity, matter, right? Mm-hmm. And then it becomes manifest through the manifestation of all of the individuals, right? So it doesn't have in Plotinus this self-standing existence, but rather it's a kind of shadow cast by soul, if you like, by soul's intention to create illimitable instances. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what you think about that, Asfandio.
Well, I've been processing this for a few months now. I still don't know what I think about it. I mean, the two other things in the system are, I don't understand the function of soul, and I don't understand how these bundles work. So as I know that what Plotinus would say is that, at least per the Hutchinson paper, and also per the excerpt of your dissertation that you shared a while ago, there aren't really essences. There are certain there are certain qualities and quantities by which you can demarcate bundles from each other, but those aren't essences. And I'm not even sure how to make sense of that in a way that's not nominalist. And I'm not sure how to make sense of any kind of nominalism anyway. So I wouldn't know what that means.
I have a related question. I don't want to delay it too long and kind of keep everybody here, but I also don't want to interrupt. So you're our MC.
Maulana, it's so nice to hear your voice. Allah bless you. It's not a question, it's just a discussion point for all of us, if you're involved and if Asfandia is involved, I'd like all of you involved. But yes, let's do that in just a second. What was the last thing you said, Asfandia, Maulana? I've forgotten.
So, for instance, with Plotinus's bundle theory.
Oh yeah, the bundle theory, yeah.
There are qualities and quantities, and you can use certain qualities and quantities to demarcate bundles.
That's just a negation of immanentism. So it's just the idea that this is the world of flux and becoming. There can't be any real substance here. It's just legomene ousia. It's just so-called substance. So he's prepared to say we are so-called substances. He's just not prepared to say we are real substances. So, so why is it a bundle theory? It's not. We're obviously. Reality is intelligible, even immanent reality. It's not just inchoate bundles of stuff that is floating around. But what he's saying is, in terms of the metaphysical account of what's really going on there, the immanent properties, qua immanent, they're just isolatable properties of this particular empirical property, this particular empirical property, this particular immanent instantiation of an intelligible property as well. But the point is, the reality of it is not there. The reality of it is in the logoi, in nature, in physis, and that presupposes the reality of the forms. Those are just the immanentizing instantiations of the forms, if you like. And that's what capital N nature is. It's not the immanent particulars. It's the framework for their emergence where all of the logoi are contained. It's the lower part of the world soul, right? The upper part of soul is looking at intellect. And soul is the principle of motion, so it wants to create illimitable instances, right? That exigency causes, if you like, the logoi to descend and then the corporeal world to be created. But what is governing the individual corporeal object is the logos. It's not something immanent in its reality to that's why it's a bundle theory, because
so it's not
what is here are just the empirical properties, right?
Okay. But they are actually held together in unities. It's just that what's holding them together in unities is not immanent.
Nothing immanent.
So a cow isn't really just a cow.
No.
What's immanently present is just a bundle, but there really is a cow here, or this quasi-substance, because there is some actual principle of unity holding together these different intelligible features of the cow. Is that the idea?
If we're looking at just everyday life, and we're strolling through the mill pond, for example, there are cows. It would be absurd to deny it.
Which is why I'm asking what Plotinus is saying consistent with what seems to be just evidence that there are cows and electrons.
Yes, because when we look at appearances, we're only looking at appearances. We're not thinking of what they really are. And when he's answering the question of what they really are, he's saying, by the way, these are a very consistent set of appearances. But what's really going on here is not that the principle of unity is immanent.
Yes.
Rather, the principle of unity is transcendent.
Okay,
That's
so we're just saying
what's there immanently, right, are the empirical properties.
Yeah.
Right. The things holding them together, this is my interpretation, are your intuition of the intelligible properties, which are not immanent anyway.
Yes. And are the qualities and quantities, can they be overlapping? So you can have, for instance, have the cosmos as a whole, and that can be one quasi-substance. And then within that, you can have various overlapping quasi-substances in the forms of overlapping quantities and qualities. Is that something Plotinus would allow or not?
We're very into overlapping, yeah.
Because one of the key problems it seems to me with Aristotle, or at least with contemporary Thomists, is that there is not really such a thing as a cosmos at all. There are just certain macroscopic objects, and you can basically take a ruler and you can demarcate these different things, and there's there's no underlying unity there, and there's also no crossover between these things, and that just seems to be, well, both implausible and also inconsistent with Tawhid.
Yeah, I mean, well, if we say that not as an exegetical statement, so that you know, a clever clogs Aristotelian comes on and says something, but as a logical exigency of Aristotle's system, yes, which just believes in individual substances. No, there isn't a cosmos, strictly speaking. Especially if he doesn't know anything except his own navel, and you know, some I think you were discussing this with people recently on Twitter, but you know, some Thomists have made very desperate attempts to pretend that Aristotle is saying what Aristotle definitely never actually says, and somehow imagine that even Aristotle's prime mover does know the world. But there's no evidence of that whatsoever. Real Aristotle exegetes say that's absolute nonsense, and there's no actual text in Aristotle whatsoever saying that, and lots of texts saying the opposite. So a lot of the time when Aristotle looks really good, go and have a look. It's actually Thomists. But anyway, Siddy, that is absolutely the case.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to hold this up, but the final issue is I don't understand the role of soul. I think it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Intelligibles can't be grounded in sensible particulars. That seems to be as clear as anything in philosophy. If intelligible particulars are grounded in human minds, that seems to be it entails skepticism, and it also seems to be self.
I think this is a wonderful historical moment. A graduate of the Oxford PPE is saying that is as certain as anything in philosophy. That's fantastic.
But so that gets you to then establishing the realm of intellect or the realm of forms. But I don't understand the necessity for the intermediary of soul. Why can't you just have intellect and then nature?
Yeah, I don't think there's a necessity either if you're talking about an actual hypostasis of soul. But I think the principle that you have, that there is the principle of motion, there is the principle of creative desire, right? What it's making sense of is the fact that you have a moving image of eternity. In fact, I was going to go on to 3.8 today, but 3.7, which is on time and eternity, but I don't think I will now. It's getting too late. You don't, I think it's making sense of the fact that you have a moving image of eternity, that you have a world which is, it's that how do we make this transition from timeless intelligibility to the multiplication of instances? What the Platonist account is trying to do is trying to say there is a level of being which is soul. Don't forget, whenever someone tries to tell you that, oh, Platonism is this ridiculous philosophy, which you're silly people for wasting your time. The basic intuition for the three hypostases, not the three hypostases, because that's the one, and intellect and soul, but for intellect, soul, and the corporeal world, the world of becoming, is just everyday lived experience, which is that we have, look, here I am in motion, right? I'm moving, physical being. So the physical being is subordinate to my motion, but the motion is subordinate to intellect in determining the nature of the motion.
So it's like microcosm, macrocosm, the microcosmic.
What Platonists are basically saying is that if that instantiated hierarchy exists, there must actually exist in being beyond instantiations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the most basic intuition, because that doesn't get you very far, but that's the basic intuition.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Is there anywhere I can read more about Plotinus' so-called bundle theory besides the Hutchinson paper? I know Gerson has something on this as well, but for some reason I find Gerson like unreadable, even if I find his prose very hard to dissect with Gerson.
Yeah, he's a bit technical, but yeah, I mean there's a lot on it in Neoplatonism and Nature, that collection. There's a lot of very good stuff in there. We can discuss this inshallah on WhatsApp.
Inshallah.
Yeah. Excellent. So let's just get to the end of this little section. Although Razi's theory was not widely adopted in kalam in its specific conclusion affirming the existence of separate, self-subsistent, uninstantiated ideas or forms, it was to become hugely influential in framing the general problematic surrounding abstract intelligible entities. In its exemplarist approach, it also foretokens the approach adopted by the school of Ibn Arabi and later integrated into a higher kalam. Again, foretokens was carefully chosen there. Razi's forms, however, would appear to be in some sense self-subsistent, whereas the ultimate Akbarian exemplars arise directly from the divine names and attributes. What's the notes there? This position, which we're going to be widely seen as the experientially and critically verified tahqiq of the question of the ultimate nature of Nafs al-Amr, and the details of which will be explored in some detail in chapter 4, has its origins in the work of Ibn Arabi. Although in the work of the greatest master, the problem has not been framed in the way it came to be by Tulsi, namely as the answer to the question of what true propositions ultimately correspond to. Ibn Arabi seems to have been the first writer to identify things as they are in themselves as an ontological realm, namely the distinct non-existent entities in divine object knowledge. Things, that is possible, are in their state of non-existence, distinct in their entities. God, transcendently glorified, but he knows them as they are in themselves, and he sees them and commands them to be existentiated, that is to exist, and they come into existence at his command. The knowledge that is with God is not general, just as the particularized essences of possible beings are not general. Rather, in itself and in God's knowledge, all is detailed. Don't forget, what's in his knowledge is not just excremental particulars, it's also world of arwah, the world of mithal. It is only with us that this generalized knowledge obtains. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I think we'll stop there. I was going to do 3-7, but it says not to go on too much. Ahlan wa sahlan, Shaykhna Mustafa, tafaddal.
Barakallahu fikum, Habibna. Yeah, it's not a very formulated question, but I just want to ask you, would you agree with the proposition that it just is?
Sorry?
Do you agree with the proposition that it just is?
What just is?
Yeah, I mean, it just is. I'm sorry. No, to the actual question, Habib. The question is very similar to what Sidi Asfandyar was asking, which, and actually with reference to Gerson, right? So if you say that what is it that manifests in the corporeal world, which is intelligible? What I remember is that he would say that the human being has an intelligibility to them, and that certain mathematical properties manifest in corporeal being. But other than that, to look for the intelligibility imminently in the physical world or corporeal world is not the way of going about it. So I'd almost, I guess the question is something like, if you say bovinity, for instance, if you say it doesn't have a substance, it doesn't have an essence, it's not intelligible. It is a bundle, which I don't know. I mean, it just occurs to me even there to ask, would that mean it doesn't have a unity, right? So if you're accepting the position that to have a natural science is what some people would say, Sadie, and so this is to run it by you and see if that even is what real Platonists believe, that there is no natural science, because, and I know you gave out a paper roughly on that topic.
Did I?
Yeah, the superiority of the explanation of the corporeal world in a Platonic system over Aristotle. What's the?
All right.
I'm sure someone else remembers the title more precisely.
Oh yeah.
So when you come to know you reflect on a corporeal particular. You might start off with Dianoia, right? So there's a cow in front of me. What I do remember is that corporeal forms in a way can aid recollection, right? They can cause like a 10B, of course, the tezkiah has to be there, right? Then you can come to know the nature of that being. But the intelligibility, is it sort of at a transcendent level that you're moving on from that thing to the intelligibility? So that intelligibility could be the various forms, and as you said in the past, those forms are those that are purely in a state of contemplation, and then there's what would perform the role of the logos, which are the lower set of forms. That's what you're either coming to know them or something through their participation. There is no substance to bovinity. I guess that's one way to just have a flat question to lead in. And then if you reflect on a cow in front of you and you come to know something of the what you're doing is you're managing to ascend to either an intelligible form or some sort of participation in an intelligible form. Is that the proper way to understand this, Maulana wa Habibna?
Maulana, as you know, the object of knowledge is the universal and the unchanging. Whether you're construing it as universal in the sense of its mental existence, or you're talking about the underlying intelligibility, it doesn't matter here. The direct object of knowledge is not the particular and determinate, it's the underlying intelligibility that allows you to cognize the particular. Now that's in Aristotle and Plato. My problem with Aristotle is he wants to have his cake and eat it. He wants to keep that nice bit of Plato that he learned in his 20 years at the academy, because it's great, but he doesn't want to pay the price of actually having to have an ontology that makes sense of it, in my opinion. So the point is, I don't see the implication for anything to do with the natural science. And of course, we know each other far too well to think that we're talking about something that we're not when we say natural science. But I don't see any implication for the immanent world is intelligible, right? I believe in cows because I see them. They're distinct. They're there. They're unities. I walk past them. They're chewing the cud, and they're there clearly. They're distinct, and that implies subsistence. That's not the issue. That's in the world of appearance, because the world of becoming is only a world of appearance, because those cows are cows in flux. And all you're ever seeing at any given moment is the cow doing this, or doing this, or doing this, or doing this, or that, or whatever it happens to be. You're seeing particular determinations, which if you analyze it into its fundamental constituents, all you can see there is empirical content. Of course, there's intelligible content there as well, but the point, my fundamental understanding, I'm not saying this as an exegetical statement about Platonism, but my understanding is that that intelligible content can't be construed as individuated at all. That's why intelligible content, that stuff which doesn't have a sensible reality, can't possibly be determinate as a sensible reality, right? Relations, yes, you have a tartib makhsus, but that's only between two substances, and it's determined by their determinacy, right? Then you have that resultant, but the relation itself doesn't become individuated, right? So you don't have, so the intelligible content, which is how you see the particular object in question in relation to all the other objects in the world, right? I'm not talking just about relation, but any number of other intelligible and not sensible objects. I view that as a prior framework which are presupposed by sensible objects. So anyway, I feel justified in talking about the cow just in terms of its empirical, what you're seeing in the world of becoming, in the world of flux. This is the basic Platonist insight, is all of your experience of the world of flux is never the distinct intelligibility of the thing. It's a particularized image which is constantly changing from one thing to another.
But why isn't the flux itself intelligible? So, for instance, we might be able to give a fully specified imminent causal account of why the cow is looking to its left and now the cow is looking up. Hypothetically, obviously not with current knowledge.
Yeah.
Why isn't everything in the immanent world also intelligible, even if that intelligibility is grounded outside of the immanent world?
You can say that it becomes manifest immanently. And if you look into, a good number of these very interesting articles where we're discussing on Platonist, on exegesis of Plotinus, he does speak about immanent forms of things. He does speak about immanent instantiations. But the point is, when you, on closer analysis, what you find is that immanent form is just a shadow. It has no other reality in and of itself, right? So you can say, yes, it's there immanently, but it really doesn't mean anything, because the only way that you can make sense of that causally and in terms of its ongoing subsistence is in terms of something which is not immanent. So you can say that it's there immanently, but that immanent state is never self-contained or self-sufficient in any way. So
the Plotinus can accept that nature is fully intelligible. His only concern is to say that intelligibility can't fundamentally be immanent. But he's not sort of being a Mysterian or an arbitrarist about what's going on in nature.
Not at all. It's the very same world we're looking at, but it's just when he explains how that works metaphysically in terms of causation, he's saying there is no immanent form there which is self-sufficient or self-contained.
Mm-hmm.
It's only the shadow cast by real intelligibility. That's it.
And so therefore natural science is eminently possible.
Just as possible as it is for anyone else.
Yeah, you just have to understand that the intelligibility isn't immanent, which I think natural science does anyway. How else do you make sense of, say, F equals ma without reference to supra-sensible intelligible realities?
Exactly.
I don't think you can. Yeah.
Exactly. And it would be beautiful if there could be a Platonism of, this is really interesting, because again, when you make the transition from being an Aristotelian Avicennan muqallid to realizing that philosophy is broader than that, you realize, hold on, even our critique of modernity might need to change a little bit. Maybe we can stop, having this knee-jerk acceptance of a Catholic narrative, which has to think that Aristotle is the perennial philosophy, because Thomas said so, and realize that the turn to a mathematical, the prioritization of mathematics in physics might not have been such a bad thing after all.
Well, I've heard it was pushed ahead by Platonists. That's part of the Catholic critique.
Exactly, and the Renaissance, is viewed as this, we have a very skewed, tend to have a very skewed understanding of the Renaissance, but it wasn't this direct precursor to modernity in the sense of, the way that the Enlightenment was. Most of the major Renaissance thinkers, their main interest was the occult and Pythagoreanism and Platonism and so forth. And I wasn't, just for you chartered people out there, I wasn't identifying those three, by the way. But, that was their main interest. So, I think we just have to have a very different understanding. That a lot of what gave rise to the mathematical focus was actually a turn again to Platonism. That's just very interesting. And I'm not going to say much more than that, except that I think that this is one of the really interesting research avenues that we should explore. And certainly it hasn't been taken in the right direction by modern science. And I just find it fascinating that modern physics is in this horrible rut where it doesn't have any empirical substantiation for its major research orientation. string theory, for example. And whereas, you have the heyday of early 20th century modern physics, where people thought they're on the cusp of this really exciting, wonderful thing. And now there's a whole clutch of physics writers who are agreeing that we're in a real mess now. We don't know even what we're saying. It's all kind of either poetry or bad metaphysics. And we don't even know how we could get back to a paradigm of empirical substantiation. We're just playing with mathematical models, not really being able to get anywhere, and we're not able to place their metaphysical status. And we're not. So it's not. I'm not saying that modern physics turned into, was inspired by Platonism and then perpetuated a Platonist program. It's obviously not anything like the case, but just that turn to seeing nature as most fundamentally mathematical, I think is something very interesting. And I think if we could start to integrate these mathematical formulas into a metaphysical framework interpreted.
Exactly that, yeah.
Yeah.
Mathematical properties like quantity, they are outside of what that thing is, which in a way makes
that's an Aristotelian analysis there.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I mean, I need to know more obviously about the Platonists, but in a way it any two things. One is that means that the thing doesn't have to be intelligible in itself, but it's participating in an intelligible reality. I mean, that's probably mixing.
Well, these don't forget, these are ideal numbers. They're not. We're not talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, and there with Galileo and Kepler, for instance, they would agree that nature is a book written in the language of mathematics, but one of them is coming from a Platonist point of view, roughly, and the other is really a mathematical reductionist, right? Really saying all there is the mathematical equation of the thing. That's Galileo.
Yeah, exactly, and don't forget. I mean, if you say that this is all the category of quantity, what one is tacitly assuming, and not so tacitly, is Aristotle's doctrine of categories, and of course that is not accepted. Many Platonists don't accept that. For example, Plotinus doesn't think that the category of quantity is a real category at all. He thinks it's completely lacking in being germa and mana. But also beyond that, this is what's very interesting about Syrianus's critique of Aristotle Metaphysics 13, when he, because it's all saying, look, Aristotle, you're very clever, but you have no idea what you're talking about. This is not Plato. The Platonic doctrine of the derivation of the corporeal world from numbers, he's talking about ideal number. He's not talking about immanent number. And so it's just and these are numbers as metaphysical principles, ultimately arising from infinity limit. And the indefinite dyad is that infinity, which then has to have a limit imposed upon it by the one, right? By one itself. So, so it's this whole framework, which it's not all there to be just simply, it's not like go and read such and such a book and it's all going to be that. There are certain things that one can do to start to explore this. And I'm not convinced that, I don't think that's just the framework that we have to adopt because it sounds kind of esoteric and exciting. But I think I think it's unexplored, and I think that's what's wrong with it.
Like 5 books a year published by Thomists on why Aristotle is compatible with modern science, and there's not an equivalent energy for Platonism.
Well, exactly, and I think beyond that, there's also just this sense that not is all well in the realm of natural science. We can all piously say, well, no one can deny the great success of modern science, but what they mean is technology, and no one can.
Yes.
Here we are doing these amazing things. I think it's wonderful. It's I don't want to use kind of bombastic language, but I'm pretty sick and tired of the whole traditionalist narrative where we all have to be really upset about we're using the the technology, but it's all very, very reluctant.
I hope this is my influence on you, but probably has nothing to do with me. But
yeah, it's you. It's all you, Habib. I've got fanaf Sheikh. But yes, I think you've influenced me. Yeah, absolutely, Habibi. It's a massive error, I think. And the main thing really is whenever I meet an Arif Billah, he just doesn't think in that way. He's got, he gets it all wrong. You get like about 29 out of 100 on his real traditionalist test. I find this every single time. Why? Because they're looking at the world in terms of haqa'iq. They're not in terms of like, I'm imposing all of my categories on the world and I'm a traditionalist. But rather, he's looking at the haqa'iq. This is the unfolding of Allah Ta'ala's plan. And that is not to confuse or conflate the qada and the maqdi, right? It's not to say, oh, well, I'm mixing up haqiqa and sharia. La, sharia is sharia and the haqiqa is haqiqa. But it's rather saying that, the khair is in my community until the end of time. Aw kama qal, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. There is, and I think this straitjacket of traditionalism where we impose right and wrong on the world in terms of, its particular, which is it's a lot of influence from the perennialists, and it comes from what is in many ways a really batil view of the world, mixed in with truth, وَلَا تَلْبِسُ الْحَقَّ بِالْبَاطِلِ. But I'm just saying that we don't have to be looking at the world always in terms of these strict dividing lines of the tradition and modernity. Because the truth is, modernity doesn't really exist. And that tradition doesn't really exist either. What exists are the haqa'iq. And they can become manifest in many, many different ways. So I just think that there has to be a little bit of a change, and I don't know how I got onto this topic. So I'm going to go back to what we were saying earlier, which is that I do think we have to adopt a critical attitude towards modern science, but we definitely have to move away from the critical thing. Well, I'm not even going to look at this because it's already been revealed as just nothing but bad modernity, getting worse and worse and worse and worse as time goes on. But we have to actually look at the, once you're out of the Aristotelian framework, it's very nice because the modernity is this kind of rejection of the Aristotelian frameworks. And when you look at it from a completely different angle, you can see that there are other things at work. It goes back even to political and social things. The Protestant Revolution, it actually wasn't all bad. There was something wrong with Catholicism. There was a lot that was right about it. And there was a lot that was wrong with it. There was a lot that was right about the old world order. But it's just not this black and white issue at all. And you can only determine that by subjecting the whole thing to tahdid. And you have to have a good criteria. And if your criterion is like taqlid of Aristotle and Catholic historians of modernity, you're not going to get very far. So I just think there are a lot of interesting perspectives that can open up if we just start looking at things and stop having this dismissive attitude to what we call modernity. Again, apart from Asfandiad, my main reason for making this change is really just putting two and two together. I've always had this as a nagging doubt, but because I would never see this. When I would encounter an Arif Billah, he just didn't think like that. He didn't think in those categories. He didn't even look at technology in that way. Because part of it is submission to God's plan. And if we're sentimentalizing this picture that's never going to come back, and was never actually even there in the first place, of traditional life, it's just wahm, essentially. So it's not to say that that whole idea is completely wrong. There's a lot of insight there, but it's just to say that we need to, I think, look at it afresh, possibly. Okay, Jazakallah khairan, everyone. Do we have any more discussion points before we go?
Can you hear me, Sidi?
Ahlan wa sahlan, Maulana.
Let me just ask a very quick question. So from your, it's just reiterating, confirming something that you mentioned earlier. So basically, Imam Razi is saying that even when we recall something that we have seen, the point at which we intelligibly conceive or conceptualize it or understand it, at that point we are actively making direct idafa with something in the intelligible realm. That's his position, basically, later position. Is that correct?
We have to be making contact. There's a distinct intelligibility there, which has to have an object which is giving rise to the distinct intelligibility. And he believes that that's by making contact directly with the forms. Yeah.
Well, right, instantaneously. Instantaneously.
Yeah, for him, knowledge is a relation. Right.
Right, exactly.
It's not a kaif as it is for those who believe in mental existence. It's a relation.
Okay.
It's a relation to something yonder.
Okay. Okay.
And you know, the interesting thing is, I actually found, although I'd love to say that I found this in the manuscript, it would be much more romantic, but I actually found this in Al-Mukhtasar al-Kalami by Ibn Arafah. This is how I found out that this was Plato's doctrine. He's a Platonist. This is Imam Razi's doctrine. He's a Platonist here because they say so, right? That was their conception of who are very close to the time. And those people are, you know, Al-Abhari, Al-Katibi. There's a very great book, Al-Mukhtasar al-Kalami. It was written just around the same time as the Martyrs of Maqasid, but it doesn't make reference to them. It's in a completely different milieu. And its concern is to tell you what are the positions of those who are the successors of Razi, or rather the reception of Razi, which tended to want to, as again, I used to think it was a great thing. I don't anymore. Right. I really don't, but they tend to think, no, we need to kind of recover the real Avicennan position. I think that was a mistake because they didn't have look, the truth is you get a real not muqallid, you get a few every century, right? And Razi was one of them. Razi, and I'm not limiting God's mercy, by a few, I don't know how many, a few hundred, I don't know. But you know, I just want to be wary. It's nice to want to have a magisterium about intellectual positions because it's like a safety blanket, but that's just not aqliyat. Aqliyat is just, it can't be taqleed. It's not like, what is our position? I don't know. Do the math, right? Then you'll find out what the position is. Yeah. Do your nazar, then you'll find out what the position, the real position is. But you know, finding out what the position is, I think that's just it's a trap. And Razi was definitely one of those people. He just didn't go for that. So, and I'm not saying that the next generation were doing taqleed. Far from it. They were great people. They were doing amazing work, and I'm sure that they were right in many of their refutations of Imam Razi. But I think in other areas, you think they're right until you understand more about what Razi's saying, and the fact that, because that's the thing, it's a fallacy to refute someone because what they're concluding is not in accordance with your starting assumptions, unless you've made sure that their starting assumptions are the same as your starting assumptions. And that's what you find with all these neo-kalam people talking about Akbarianism. It's like, your conclusion is not in accordance with my assumptions. And it's like, no, they're not. We don't believe in your assumptions. So, try
a lot of that just, has a lot to do with, sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry?
It just seems to me that when you look at the breadth and the depth of the Islamic tradition, you have so many representatives of quite a few major schools. And just a basic familiarity with that would reveal that there's a lot of different positions that have been taken over by great people, subhanAllah.
Yeah.
And
And you know, the thing is, you go back 500-600 years, Maulana, and we were so much more open-minded. And I don't mean that in some sort of kind of sentimental identity politics way, but we were so much more open-minded. And the ulama, if you look at the ulama Farangi Mahal, they'd really moved on beyond this ta'assub. It's really quite extraordinary, the ulama of the Ottoman world. The thing is, there were, you know, muta'assib people as well. I'm not saying that they didn't exist. It's just a human type. They've always been around, but certainly the dominant flavor of the later traditions, whether it's the Farangi Mahal tradition, or it's the Ottoman tradition, or it's the, yeah, even the breadth of opinion that exists in the Azhar and the real Muhaqqiqun who are there in lots of different places as well. You've got, you know, people like Abu Ghani Nabulsi, radiallahu anhu, Murani, Al-Madari, and many other, look at Abu Thana al-Alusi. Yeah, and I just think we've got this kind of reactive identitarian politics at the moment, and we want to falsely reify, we want to concretize like the Ahl Sunnah position. And I think it's sad. It's really, and it's all these Twitter people kind of deciding that they're, you know, it's like what you find now is like, I'm Ashri Shafi this, I'm this. It's like, you don't need to do that, Ahbab. You know, go and learn a lot, really give yourself to the pursuit of knowledge, and you won't be talking like that anymore. Go and read the last chapter of Mizan al-Amal. I really highly recommend that to everyone. You've got Mizan al-Amal, go to the last chapter. I was teaching Mizan al-Amal very badly at Zaytuna, and I was very blessed to have Sheikh Marshouk come in, because we're very good friends, alhamdulillah. But he came in for the last session. I forced him actually to teach the, it was, you know, it was like pulling teeth, but I forced him to teach the last session. It happened to be that last chapter. And Sheikh Marshouk is wonderful. If you get to know him, he's completely opposed to taqleed in any form. Yes. And he specifically says that, you know, aqliyat today have become naqliyat. Right, and unbeknownst to people, aqliyat have become naqliyat. And anyway, so he taught us that chapter. It was beautiful. You really got to read that chapter. It's really amazing. And I really, you know, it's interesting. I deliberately, about 12 years ago, it was probably about 15 years ago now, because I'm getting older. It was 2006. So anyway, so I deliberately made the decision. When I embark on my Talab al-Ilm, I'm not going to read Al-Ghazali at all, and I'm not going to read Mullah Sadra at all. And I kept my promise. For, you know, 15 years, I didn't read any Mullah Sadra, and I didn't read any Al-Ghazali, because I could see from various very strong indications that whole narrative about Al-Ghazali and Mullah Sadra, and the various things, the various ways that they play a role in this narrative about the Aqliyat is false. And so I didn't want to be led by reading their works, as silly as that sounds, and probably was. But actually, I'm pretty happy about it now, because I spent the rest of the time reading everyone else. And now when I read Imam al-Ghazali and Mullah Sadra, you just situate them in a completely different way. But the most extraordinary thing, I mean, leave out Mullah Sadra for a while. The most extraordinary thing about Imam al-Ghazali is that he's just our guy, like totally. Like he's not theirs, you know, the kind of nominalist, atomist, occasionalist thing. He's just not theirs at all. Not in the slightest. He's ours. He's totally a proto-Akbarian. And I'm not in any way saying that this is an original insight. I mean,
sure.
Mustafa Steyer, who's present, has made this insight long ago and with much more substantiation. But I just have seen it now bright as day. And I think, again, you know, people are not utilizing the wealth of amazing material in the late Imam al-Ghazali, because they're imposing all of these presuppositions onto him about his nature as this kind of again, this kind of dogmatic Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And then you read Al-Ghazali in Faisal al-Tafriqa, he says, stop treating Imam al-Ash'ari like a prophet. He's not a prophet. Go and read the last section of Mizan al-Amal. Go and read any number of statements against Taqlid. They're in almost every work by Imam al-Ghazali. So, I mean, he is like the ultimate anti-Taqlid practitioner. So I think he's amazing. I'm really enjoying, especially like Mishkat al-Anwar. In any case, Jazakumullah khairan, everyone. I think we'll call it a day now.
All right. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Keep us in your prayers, everyone. I hope to see you soon.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sayyidina.
We'll meet next week at the same time. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah,
Wa alaikum assalam.